I don't think I ever asked him about his return visits to Northwest Indiana. He had a few, not many. I'd heard from several people who had been at Purdue Calumet when he came to speak there. Some group or another was honoring him. Everybody held this man up on a pedestal. He was our local interpreter of our history and culture. And I think he needled people. I think he rubbed them the wrong way. He was not this sweet, cuddly guy. He was curmudgeonly. He was prickly. He would sass people back when they asked him questions about things. He would say things, and I heard this second or third hand. You know, you like that? You like the beaches around here with the fish coming up and the stink from the mills? Why do you live around here? And I don't think it went over well. I didn't want to remind him of that, so I never really asked him about it. But it was strange when he and I would speak over the phone in some of these conversations. This is like 1997, 98, 99. Only a handful of times, maybe 7 or 8 times did he call me. He'd always called me after I wrote the story about him. And he would talk about the area, and he would ask me about things and places. You know, is Phil Schmidt's restaurant still in Hammond? And it was. My name is Mark Taylor. I'm born and raised in Northwest Indiana. Grew up in Hammond, Indiana, in the Hessville neighborhood of Hammond. I went to Our Lady of Perpetual Help School, Morton High School, Purdue Cal, and ended up at Indiana University, where I studied journalism. As a kid growing up, I, of course, learned about Gene Shepard through his great book, In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash, which was based on a series of stories that he wrote for Playboy magazine and other publications in the 50s and 60s. My Uncle Jack Wills had gone to school with Gene Shepard at Hammond High, and I hadn't heard of him, but when I read this book, it was my life. It was my dad's life. My father and his friends would go fishing at Cedar Lake, take us boys along. Sometimes they'd have too much to drink, and our mothers would have to come pick us up. We would go shopping every year at the Goldblatts in downtown Hammond. So A Christmas Story, or some of the stories leading up to A Christmas Story, the movie, were our stories as a kid, going to see Santa Claus there. My uncles all worked in the steel mills. I later worked in the steel mills. So Gene Shepard's story was my story and the story of a lot of people who grew up in Northwest Indiana, particularly in Hammond. When I was a reporter for the Gary Post-Tribune, I was charged with writing a story. I was assigned to do a story about A Christmas Story. So I don't even remember how, but somehow I got a hold of him at Sanibel Island in Florida, where he had been living for some years. And I interviewed him about A Christmas Story. He told me it was an anti-war, anti-gun story, which sort of shocked me, as well as the film critic then for the Post-Tribune. We didn't know anything about this. We thought it was just a story about a kid with a Christmas wish. And he said, no, there was something deeper to it than that. I started getting phone calls from Gene Shepard, random calls, not timed to anything, but periodically something came up in the news and he'd call me about it. And I think he was feeling lonely. He'd just lost his wife of 20-some years. He would take a contrarian point of view on just about anything, and I think he liked doing that. He was an agitator, and he liked agitating things and making you think about things in a different way from a different perspective. He would call me, and he would usually rib me. I don't know how, but somehow he read stories of mine, maybe on the wires or something, and he would rib me about them, good-naturedly, but sometimes I would ask him about different aspects of his life and stories that he'd written, he would talk about all of these characters and places that we all knew and grew up and loved, and that's what made him really loved in Northwest Indiana. And he would tell me, that's a bunch of baloney. He'd say there was no Flick. I said, well, yeah, I went to school with Flickingers, Jean Flickinger, and her dad ran a tavern, Flicks. He says, yeah, but they're not the people in the story. I just like the names, Schwartz and Flick, and those. They were good local names, a lot of ethnic names from our area. So those characters appeared, and I was surprised he didn't know these people, or maybe he knew them, but they weren't the same people characterized in his books and stories. And sometimes when he would call, I would switch my phone to conference call, and I would kind of motion everybody to keep it down. And that's Gene Shepard? Shepard's on the phone. I go, yeah, quiet, just listen. And we'd all sit there as he'd spin stories in that inimitable voice of his, and we'd just be transfixed. It was a wonderful thing, particularly if this was one of your childhood heroes, and now here he was telling you stories of his life, and we didn't know if they were true or not. It didn't matter. They were just great stories.